everybody. Good evening. Last week we did the rapture, and I hope that was hopeful to you. If you ask what is the next end-time prophetical event to happen, it is the rapture. Everything else is after that. The rapture can happen anytime. So today we're going to actually speed up a little bit. I'm going to do 2 sessions at one time. We're going to do the peace treaty for the first maybe 20 minutes, and then the remaining time I'm going to rush through the topic of the Antichrist. There's a lot of material to cover. So today we're going to start off with the peace treaty. And I've divided this session into 4 parts. We will look at the position of the treaty. We will look at the conditions for the treaty, the divisions of the treaty, and the conclusion of the treaty. Okay? First, let's look at the position of the treaty. Now, what is it? The peace treaty is a treaty that is made in Israel. It involves Israel. And when is it? The next event to happen is a rapture. And after the rapture happened, there is a period of unspecified duration. And after that period, or it may be immediately, there is no way to know, but it's after the rapture, then there is a treaty that is signed between 2 groups, and one of the groups is Israel. And this treaty sets off something that we studied earlier called as the last week of Daniel's 70 weeks. Now, something that you will realize as we do today's session onward is that there will be a lot of cross connections with what we've done in the past. So everything is going to be connected again and again, and then it'll make much more sense. So some of the things that we talked about in the past, you may think, what's the purpose of that? It's all going to get connected today onward. Okay, so once the peace treaty happens, it sets in motion the 70th week of Daniel's 70 weeks. You may remember that the first 69 weeks are completed, and right now we are living in the space between the 69th week and the 70th week. And when the peace treaty is signed, the 70th week begins, which is a period of 7 years. And I want to point to 2 verses. One verse is something that we've already looked at. In Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, it says, "And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week. And for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of abomination shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator." This is a passage that we looked at. It was called the 70-week prophecy, Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 to 27. Okay, so this is a 70-week prophecy that we already looked at. And this is talking about the covenant that the Antichrist is going to make. Let's look at another prophecy that mentions this covenant, talking from Israel's side. This is Isaiah saying, "Because you have said, we have made a covenant with death, and with Sheol we have an agreement. When the overwhelming whip passes through, it will not come to us, for we have made lies our refuge, and in falsehood we have taken shelter." In the past, historically, Israel has made covenants, which is even in the Bible. You'll see how they made a covenant with Egypt when they were not supposed to make a covenant. So they made covenants with surrounding countries when they should not have made covenants with those countries, and it always backfired. It always backfired. So this treaty, the position of this treaty, when does it happen? It is going to happen after an unspecified duration, after the rapture. Okay. Second, let's look at the conditions for the treaty. Now, obviously, if there's a treaty and there are 2 people involved, the condition is that those 2 people exist. And the first condition for the peace treaty is the formation of Israel. And this has been prophesied in what was called as the Olivet Discourse. I don't think we really mentioned it, but I'm going to mention it now. It was referred to when Jesus talked about the fig tree. And so he says in Matthew chapter 24, verses 32 to 34, he said, "Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened." Now, for this treaty to happen, there needs to be a country called Israel. Now, I'm going to go back, way back, when we did, I think it's the very first lesson that we did on Daniel chapter 2 and chapter 7, when we looked at the two visions. I talked about the four empires. And in those four empires, I talked about how Israel, which was a northern kingdom, and Judah, which was a southern kingdom, they were exiled separately. The northern kingdom, Israel, was exiled by Assyria, and then 120 years later, the southern kingdom, Judah, was exiled by the Babylonian Empire. The 10 tribes of the northern kingdom never came back. But the southern kingdom that had Judah and Benjamin, which were captured by the Babylonian Empire, and then it was the Medo-Persian Empire after that, there Cyrus allowed them to come back. And so Israel became a country again, as we see in the book of Ezra, Nehemiah, and so on. And so it was a country, and at the time of Jesus, it was a country until AD 70, when General Titus, the son of Octavius Caesar, came down and destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. And from that point on, everybody went everywhere. And so for 2,000 years, there was no country by the name of Israel. And so what happened is, when the country of Israel was not there, then the peace treaty cannot happen. We all come from different countries. I come from India, and India has been around for 4,000 years. And what if India stopped existing? What if America stopped existing? What if a country, let's say Greece, stopped existing? What happens to all its people? They all were scattered everywhere. But in 1948, something amazing happened. Now, in 1922, there was a British mandate for Palestine. It was in place since 1922. And there was decades of Jewish immigration from all over the world back to Palestine. In 1947, the UN adopted a resolution that recommended the separation of Palestine into a Jewish side and an Arab side. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion, the head of the Jewish Agency, proclaimed the establishment of the State of Israel. And the same day, the US, at that time it was President Harry Truman, who recognized Israel as a country on the same day. The next day, the Arab nations around Israel came to war against Israel. And that war lasted for a year, and Israel won that war. It was such a fresh country, but it won that war against its Arab neighbors. And in those first 3 years, 600,000 Israelis from all over the world, because now they are scattered all over the world, they streamed down towards their newly formed country that wasn't there for 2,000 years. And so the formation of Israel itself as a country itself is a miracle. So the first condition for the treaty is that there was the formation of Israel. The second condition for the treaty is the revival of the Roman Empire. Now, I'm going to go back to Daniel chapter 2 that we read, and let me just read a verse, verses 40 to 43, and you will remember this because we studied this, and this is talking about the Roman Empire and the revived Roman Empire. Look what it says. "Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, For iron breaks and smashes everything, and as iron breaks things to pieces, so it'll crush and break all the others. And just as you saw that the feet and the toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom. Yet it will have some of the strength of iron, even as you saw iron mixed with clay. And as the toes are partly iron and partly clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle, just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay. So the people will be a mixture and will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. Now this, we said, was the Roman Empire, and then the iron and clay together is the revived Roman Empire. Now let me just give you a little bit of history of how this revived Roman Empire came to be. There wasn't a revived Roman Empire until 1945. In 1945, the end of World War II left Europe devastated, and they wanted some kind of integration so that future conflicts could be avoided. In 1950, the French Minister Robert Schuman proposed the ECSC in May 9. In 1951, the Paris Treaty was signed, establishing the ECSC the following year. And the original members were West Germany, France, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Then all the way in 1957, they established the European Economic Community, these countries. Then several decades later, in 1993, the Maastricht Treaty came into effect in November 1, creating the European Union. Then in 1997, the Treaty of Amsterdam was signed, and they gave Europe a greater role. In 1999, the euro was created. And then all the way later in 2020, the United Kingdom officially left the EU, and in 2025, 27 countries are in the EU. Okay, so this, like we said earlier, is the revived Roman Empire because it is coming out of the geographic ashes of the Roman Empire. And if you remember, at that time I showed you the map of how the Roman Empire was more in Europe compared to the previous empire, which was the Greek Empire, which was more towards Asia. And just for fun, I'm going to show you the leadership structure of the EU. Interestingly, there are three parts of the decision-making body in the EU, and that is the European Commission, the Council of the EU, and the European Parliament. And the heads of all these people today are Roberta Metsola of the European Parliament, the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, and the Council of the EU. That's usually a rotating council. So now I think for these 6 months, it's Poland with 2 other countries. And so the Polish Minister for European Union Affairs is the head of that council of the EU. And it's very interesting that there are 3 components to the decision-making body of the EU. I'm not sure it connects or not, but if you remember the vision that Daniel had in Daniel chapter 7, he said he saw a beast with 10 horns, and 3 horns were uprooted by a little horn. And it's very interesting because a little horn is the person who becomes the Antichrist. And he overthrows 3 kings or 3 parts, 3 leaders, 3 presidents. I don't know if this is connected. It could be. But 2 things had to happen for this treaty to happen. One is the formation of Israel, and that happened in 1948. And second is the formation of the EU, which happened in 1993, but started in 57. Okay? Now, let's look at the division of the treaty. Now, there are 3 parts to this treaty, and I've used this kind of structure because I'm going to use the same structure when we study the book of Revelation as well. There are 3 parts. We will look at the first 3.5 years, and in this 3.5 years, the peace treaty will be honored. Now, the peace treaty is a treaty between the Antichrist, who is from the revived Roman Empire. As we said today, it could be from the EU, and a leader of the EU. I'm not saying it's going to happen today. I'm not saying the leader is there right now. But a upcoming leader in the future of the EU will rise up and make a peace treaty with Israel. What that entails, we are not sure, except that it involves peace. And if we know anything about Israel, they have not had peace. From the day after the formation of their country, they've had war. And every American president has tried to get peace of Israel with its neighbors, but there has never been peace. And there will never be peace until this peace treaty, until the Antichrist comes along and establishes peace in Israel with its neighbors. Maybe it involves some agreement of military benefits or economic benefits. Regardless, the idea is that there will be peace in Israel. And for the first 3.5 years of that peace treaty, everybody will think this is amazing, because for decades and years, Israel has not had peace, and now finally they will have peace. The second part of the treaty is the inter-half period. This is the period between the two halves of the 7-year period. And if you remember from what we studied before, there is a first 3.5 years and there is a second 3.5 years. And the second 3.5 years is very important. But in between that, in the middle, in the midpoint, in the inter-half period, there will be two events that will take place. The first is in what is written in Revelation chapter 12 verses 7 through 9. Then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, the ancient serpent called the devil, or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. So the first thing that happens in the inter-half period between the two 3.5 periods is that Satan will be thrown to earth. And the second event that happens is what we already read in Daniel chapter 9 verse 27. It says, in the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering, and at the temple he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. The Antichrist, even though he signed a 7-year peace treaty with them, he will do something in the middle of the 7 years that will be an abomination in Jerusalem. And this is something that we talked about both when we did Daniel chapter 9 and when we did the Olivet Discourse, when we talked about it. Okay, so two things happen. One is Satan is thrown down from heaven, and two, the Antichrist will set up an abomination in the middle of the treaty in Jerusalem that will change the course of the peace treaty. This is the Antichrist, and let's read another verse about the Antichrist in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verses 3 and 4. Let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. So this is the Antichrist, and he will reveal himself as against God and against everything about God at this time. Okay? So we have the first 3.5 years, the inter-half period, and we have the second 3.5 years when the treaty will not be honored and the beast, the Antichrist, will torture Israel. Let me read 2 verses. Revelation chapter 20 verse 4 says, I saw thrones on which were seated those who had been given authority to judge, and I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony about Jesus and because of the word of God. They had not worshipped the beast or its image and had not received the mark on their foreheads or on their hands. And another verse in Revelation 13 verse 15, the second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast, so that the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. So anybody who refused to worship the Antichrist was tortured and killed. And these verses from Revelation show that those people who were killed for their faith will show up in heaven. And so this is the division of the treaty. And fourth, we will look at the conclusion of this treaty. How will this peace treaty, it was a peace treaty, it's not peace treaty anymore. How will this treaty end? This will end, and what I say now will be reminiscent of what I've said multiple times in several sessions, is that it will end with Armageddon. It'll be a battle between Christ and the Antichrist. And in Revelation chapter 19, verses 11 through 21, I'm not going to read it. It talks about Armageddon and how the beast was captured, and with it the false prophet, and how they were thrown alive into the lake of fire. And that's how this 7-year period is going to end. Now, this peace treaty, as you will now recognize, it fits in with the 70th Daniel week. Okay, the 70th week of Daniel, 70 weeks of prophecy. And the 3.5 time period that we talked about earlier, it fits in with the times of the Gentiles. If you remember, it fits in with the times of the Gentiles. Okay? All right. So all these pieces should slowly start to connect, and then towards the end, we'll have a complete picture of as much as possible. I know chronology is very difficult when you talk about end times. As much as possible, at least a crude idea of how things are going to play out. All right, so now we've talked so much about the Antichrist. Now let's look at the Antichrist. So we looked at the rapture, we looked at the peace treaty, and we're going to look at the Antichrist. I don't know if you got a chance to read Daniel 8, but Daniel 8 and Daniel 11 are the two main chapters that talk about the Antichrist. So there are several chapters that talk about the Antichrist. Chapter 2, chapter 7, which we already looked at. Chapter 9, we looked at multiple times, including today. And then 8 and 11 are the other two. Revelation 13, we also mentioned today, but that is the other chapter. So these are the chapters, the main chapters that talk about the Antichrist. I had wanted to read a portion of Daniel chapter 8. But let me just skip over some parts, because it's just, again, if you get a chance before every session, if you can please read up the chapters related to the session, it'll make it much easier for you to understand what we are saying. Daniel chapter 8, I wanted to read this, but I won't. I'll move on. This is the actual vision that Daniel has, and then is the interpretation of the vision, which I'll read. So I'll read the interpretation of the vision and not the vision itself. If you can read Daniel chapter 8, the vision, then you'll understand everything. But this is a key passage that talks about the Antichrist. Let me read for us. As for the ram that you saw with the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia, and the goat is the king of Greece. And the great horn between his eyes is the first king. As for the horn that is broken, in place of which 4 others rose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from this nation, but not with his power. So the ram is the Medo-Persian Empire, the 2 parts of the Medo-Persian Empire. The goat is the Greek Empire. The first king is, I think, Prince Philip. The horn that is broken is Alexander the Great. And as we mentioned in lectures past, because Alexander the Great died when he was 33, he didn't have an heir that was old enough to become king. And so 4 generals took over. And so that's what it says here. 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with power. And at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face. Now, this is a king who is called Antiochus the Fourth, and he is a precursor to the Antichrist. He's a king of bold face, and what it says next is it relates both to Antiochus and to the Antichrist who's going to come in the future. There is this thing in the Old Testament called typology, where something can be a type of something to come in the New Testament or in the future. And here Antiochus is that type. And so what it says here is that his power shall be great, but not by his own power. He shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men, the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many. He shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. The vision of the evenings and the mornings has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. Let me just give you a little more history on this. Of the 4 generals that became king in the Greek Empire, 2 of them were called the Seleucid dynasty and the Ptolemaic dynasty. Okay, they were the Seleucid kings and the Ptolemaic kings. Also in Daniel chapter 11, it talks about the war between the king of the north and the king of the south. And the king of the north and the king of the south are these 2 kings. The northern king is Antiochus, who is from the Seleucid dynasty, and the southern king is from the Ptolemaic dynasty. Okay, so just to give you an introduction to Daniel chapter 11 as well. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make it easy so we don't have to read too many chapters. I'm going to give you a chart that shows you the similarity between Antiochus and the Antichrist. So Antiochus, as we said, is from the Greek Empire, Antiochus the Fourth. He's the type, the Antichrist is the antitype. Okay, and he's from the Roman Empire, as we said, the revived Roman Empire. Now I'm going to quickly go through the similarities between the 2 of them, and then you will see how one is a type and one is the antitype. So when it talks about one, it's also talking about the other, in this case about the Antichrist. Antiochus was symbolized by horns that were little, and so you can look at the reference. It's Daniel chapter 8 and this is Daniel chapter 9, and the Antichrist is symbolized by horns that were little. He was a stern-faced king. The Antichrist will have an imposing look. He was a master of intrigue, and the Antichrist will also be a master of intrigue, because he's going to solve a problem that nobody has ever solved, which is bring peace to Israel. Antiochus had great power, but not his own, and he destroyed many, including Jews. The Antichrist will also have power and will be energized by Satan, and he will attack God's people as well. Antiochus destroyed thousands, and the Antichrist will destroy more. Antiochus prospered for a little while, and the Antichrist will prosper for a brief time. Actually, for about 7 years is when he will prosper. Antiochus, he persecuted the saints, and of course, he's the one that offered sacrifices on the altar, sacrificed a pig on the altar, which is written in Maccabees, in 1 Maccabees chapter 1. And he also declared himself to be deity. And so the Antichrist will also do the same thing. He will oppress believers. Antiochus was a deceiver. The Antichrist will be a master deceiver. He's drawing his strength from Satan, who is the greatest deceiver. Antiochus was proud. He called himself the illustrious one, or the God manifest. And the Antichrist will be one of the most arrogant individuals the world has ever known. He will remove the daily sacrifice in the temple, and he installed his image. And this is seen in Daniel chapter 8. And the same thing will be done by the Antichrist, who will install the abomination that causes desolation. He blasphemed God, and the Antichrist will blaspheme God. And finally, he's not killed by human hands. And as we read, and the Antichrist will not be killed by human hands. In fact, it'll be Jesus Christ who will kill the Antichrist. But by the way, when Antiochus died, he was struck by an incurable plague that caused pain in his stomach. And he fell from his chariot, and there was a bruising of his body. He was cast to the ground, and worms ate his body. And so that's why it says he was not killed by human hands. Okay, so this similarity, this is an overview essentially of Daniel chapter 8, showing how Antiochus IV is a type of Antichrist, and they are almost identical, except that the Antichrist is much severe in intensity. Okay, so now what I did, to make it even easier, is because the Antichrist is over several chapters, what I did is I took all these chapters, combined all the information about the Antichrist, and I made it into one chart. And each chart, each line will have the different references, because there's a lot of overlap. So we're going to very quickly go through this chart, and this is all there is for the rest of the session, is all the detail about the Antichrist that is written in all of Scripture. Okay? So I'm going to put it all in one chart, and we're going to go through it line by line. This is a summary of the Antichrist. So the Antichrist, this will have Daniel chapter 7, 9, and 11. This will have 2 Thessalonian references, Revelation, mainly 13 references, and then the other references. Okay? And obviously you can, I don't know, you're not going to do it, but you know how when you go to church and the pastor says, oh, go home and look at this passage, read this parable a little more, and everybody nods their heads, but nobody ever goes home and does it. You have lunch, and by the time the first mouthful has gone down your throat, you've forgotten about the sermon. So there's no point in me telling you to go home and read it. Not going to happen. All right, but you can at least look at it here. So let me give you the characteristics of the Antichrist. He's a political figure who becomes powerful and advanced. Now, when I talk about the Antichrist, I want you to think of a person. Okay? Think of a person, I mean, not your enemy, but some world leader who has been ruthless. And this is not to say that it is that person. It need not be the person. But the reason I'm saying this is so that you remember that the Antichrist is a person. Even though Revelation chapter 13 calls him a beast, he is not a beast in the sense that Satan is, he's not an angel. He is a human being. So think about a very powerful, ruthless person who has killed people and tortured people, whatever person comes to mind. I know it's terrible to do this, but it's just for you to know that this is an actual person who lives and breathes like you and me. But he has sold himself to the devil, and now he is an agent of the devil at the highest realms. Okay? So this human being is a political figure who becomes powerful and advances not by his own power. He will reject whatever religion is practiced by his ancestors, likely be an atheist, although he evidently will use religion to gain his position of power. He will spew shockingly blasphemous words against Christ. He will deny the Father and the Son and refuse the incarnation of Jesus. Now this is from 1 John chapter 2 and 2 John 7, where John gives a generic description of the Antichrist, not specifically talking about the Antichrist. Okay? 1 John says that antichrists will occur, and so this is what they do. They deny the deity of Jesus. He will serve a god of military might and will spend lavishly to increase his military power and will engage in constant war. He is not Satan, but is influenced by him and will be a man of lawlessness. And he will be from the Roman Empire, as we said. He will defeat 3 kings of the Roman Empire, and 7 other kings will surrender to him. Now, this is from both the visions in Daniel chapter 2, where it talks about the 10 toes, and in Daniel chapter 7, where it talks about the 4th beast with the 10 horns. And at that time, when we studied this, I said the 10 need not be an actual number. It can be a figurative number that shows completion. That means you don't need to wait, okay, Britain left the EU, and so let's wait for 17 other countries to leave the EU so it becomes 10. That's not what it is. It's talking about a complete number, whatever that complete number is. Next, like we said, he will make an agreement with Israel for 7 years. As we just said, he will speak boastfully against God and will lead a rebellion. And the reason I made this chart is because there was a lot of repetition of stuff, and I just wanted to put it all in one place where it showed where each of these are in these references. He will persecute the saints for 3.5 years, and this is the second half of the 7-year period. He will claim to be God and desire to be worshipped. He will place an abomination of desolation in Jerusalem. And this is also something that we talked about. He will display his power with miracles to deceive people, to discourage them from worshiping God. And if you think this is unusual for a human being to do this, he's getting direct strength from Satan, and so he's able to do this. Other people in the past, based on satanic activity, have been able to do miracles. So why not the Antichrist? God's wrath will be poured out upon the Antichrist and the whole sinful world in the last days during the tribulation period. And this is something that we are going to study in Revelation chapter 6 through 19, which we will talk about next week. An Arab bloc with or led by Egypt will attack the Antichrist and be destroyed. This is in Daniel chapter 11, is something that we didn't read. Like I said, Daniel 8 and Daniel 11 talk extensively about the Antichrist. He will invade Israel. This is so ironic because he had a peace treaty with Israel, but he will invade Israel. Jordan will be spared, but Libya, Ethiopia, and Sudan will be subdued by the Antichrist. And if you notice, geographically, it's not like Ethiopia and Sudan and Libya are around Israel, right? Around Israel, there's only Jordan. But regardless, he is a military person, and there will be war, and countries will be pulled into the war. Okay. We will be looking at Ezekiel chapter 38 almost at the very end. Almost at the very end. There will be a battle between the Antichrist and the armies of the east and the north, and we will look at that when we look at Revelation chapter 9 and Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39. This, interestingly, is something that showed up in the end time events written in the Quran. And I mentioned it when it talked about Gog and Magog. He will meet these attacking forces in Palestine and make his headquarters in Jerusalem, between the Mediterranean Sea on the west and the Dead Sea on the east. And this is very interesting. Let me read the verse for you. Daniel chapter 11, verse 45. It's so interesting how it's written, because if you look at the map, you will see why it says that. In Daniel chapter 11, verse 45, it says this: He will pitch his royal tents between the seas at the beautiful holy mountain. Between the seas at the beautiful holy mountain. And if you look at Jerusalem, if you look at Israel, Israel is between the Mediterranean Sea on the west side and the Dead Sea on the east side. Very interesting. And then finally, the final war will be fought in Israel in the valley of Megiddo, when the Antichrist will be destroyed by the Christ, and there are references to that all over the place. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of the Antichrist. Very ruthless person. And he will be very predominant in those final 7 years. And as it turns out, we may never know who it is, because the church would have gone by then, right? I mean, the rapture would have happened by then and we would have gone. So we won't know who it is. And like I said, the position of the treaty, the rapture happens next, then unspecified duration, then the peace treaty when the Antichrist comes into play. But let's say, for example, that the rapture was going to happen today, and the peace treaty would be signed, I don't know, maybe let's say next year. And if that is the case, then 7 years from that point is when Jesus comes back. In a 7-year period of tribulation and so on, then Jesus comes back. That means right now, today, the Antichrist is living, right? He may or may not be a leader yet, but he is living. And so when the rapture happens, if the peace treaty is within a short period of time, the people that lived during the rapture, were alive during the rapture, would have heard about the Antichrist. Or maybe he would be a leader at that time. There's no way to know. Okay, but all we know is that he is going to be a human being like you and me, who comes to power and going to be ruthless and going to be second in command. Second to Satan is going to be the Antichrist. Very, very sad and very, very intriguing. If Jesus told Judas, it would have been better if you were not born, right? He's talking to a human being that grew up like all of us. And that's how it is for the Antichrist. It's somebody that grew up like all of us, went to school, went to, I don't know, maybe even went to Sunday school, or studied history and physics and geography, and then ends up being the absolute worst human being that could ever be. But he will come to an end, and Christ will bring him to an end. So all this material, not the slides, but all the text, all the tables and everything will be on my website. It's all on my website. There's a bunch of resources on my website. If you've not gone on my website, please go on my website. I've spent a lot of time on my website with stuff, so it'll be there. Thank you, everybody. I'll see you next week. Thank you.